Hey everybody, Tevin here, lead educator with Grow Local South Texas. Today we're going to do our first Ask Our Educator Q&A. Great question. The spider mites, they're a little tricky. This time of year when we're not getting much rain, it's dry outside, and your plants are kind of a great home for them to live on because it keeps them away off the ground and from their natural predators. That being said, one thing you can do is get a natural spray. So you can make your own at home, and this would be just getting some a mild detergent, and then you can mix that with water as well, maybe a little bit of baking soda, and possibly if you want to add some apple cider vinegar into that mixture, and then you can just kind of spray your plants with that. That typically helps with pests as a natural pest deterrent. As for the dill, we're getting pretty late in the season for dill. So as the heat, our South Texas heat rolls in, there's a lot of our more delicate plants. We're kind of missed that time frame for planting. So a lot of the herbs, we're kind of coming out of that season. So you might want to look for something that's a little bit more hardy and heat and drought resistant. So something, if you're planting in pots, something like lemongrass or some rosemary that's a little hardier, can handle the heat, and it will do well in pots. And they're both natural pest deterrents. So having something like that alongside would kind of help with your spider mite problem. So kind of feeding off of that last question, uh, we are getting late in the season for growing for us as the heat rolls in. So you want to be focusing on some plants that can handle the heat and handle the lack of rain that we're getting. So if you're going for vegetables, things like okra, melons, you can still get away with some tomatoes and peppers if they're already larger plants. If you go to Gill's or Turner's, one of the local nurseries, and pick up some seasonal vegetables that they have, those should all do well for now if you're planting in the next week or two or three. If you wait any longer, it's just a little too hot. They're not gonna be able to take root very well. Also, if you're looking for more herbs, you want to try some of the hardier herbs, like maybe a Thai basil or a different variety of basil. Cuban oregano will thrive, as well as something hardier like the rosemary, or something, like I said, mentioned before, the lemongrass. They all do well, and just depends on if you're doing these in pots or if you have space in your yard for something tall like okra, as well as things like amaranth grow well, or fruit trees, native plants, and moringa can grow well in the heat as well. It sounds like you're on the right path for getting rid of your pests. Using these built-in tools we have here, our fingers, of just taking the time to pull those pests off, is one of your best routes to go. It's the easiest method to kind of get rid of those without using any chemical pesticides. The neem is also great. As we had a question before, some people have a little bit of issue with breathing in the neem oil. So if you're trying to go with something a little bit more natural, you could try that mixture I tried before of some water, baking soda, and a mild detergent. That typically helps as well. And as for the eggshells, that's a great way to go as well. It just adds another barrier to kind of keep these creatures off of your plants. As well as if you're working with the tomatoes, you want to focus on trimming the bottom 8 to 10 inches of your branches from your tomato plant, so you have some buffer space between the soil and your tomato plant. So if you just trim those branches off, so then all there is the main stem is going to, one, prevent your creatures. They're going to have less room to climb up, so it's going to prevent them to reaching your plants. But also it's going to encourage your tomato plant to produce more tomatoes if you kind of take away some of those suckers at the bottom of your tomato. So maybe try one of those methods out and see if they work out. Yes, I would say it's never too late to uh, pick off any damaged leaves, or anything that may have some type of infestation with creatures. The more you remove those damaged leaves, the better, the healthier the plant will be. It's going to encourage some new growth on there. So even if you do have to pick off a lot of those leaves, just know that that's going to help your plant get a little bit stronger and encourage it to have new growth. So it can't necessarily hurt to continue to pick those things off. As we mentioned before, there are an array of natural sprays you can either create or use, like the neem oil. So that might help. And then a mild detergent is going to help as well, just to keep those pests off your plants. So maybe try those things, and if you want to go further, you could also maybe work on doing some companion planting and planting some lemongrass or rosemary that's going to help deter pests as well. You can also try marigolds, which are help with some natural pest control as well. So maybe kind of plant those around your plants that are getting the damage around those peppers and see if that helps. With the hanging baskets, it's a little bit different. You're going to have less space to work with, and they do get jostled around quite a bit from the wind and our weather, our high winds and our South Texas heat. So the one that's in the sun, I would say go for something with like a perennial spinach. So we had the question earlier of what's good to plant. Perennial spinaches are really the way to go right now to grow in the summer. So perennial spinaches would be things like New Zealand spinach, Okinawa, green harmony, or also known as longevity spinach. They're very hardy spinaches, and they can handle the heat as well as the lack of rain. But since they're going to be in a hanging basket, they'll be able to deal with it being kind of moved around and jostled around from the wind. And they shouldn't get much damage to them. So they kind of grow like crazy. So you can get those grown, and they'll kind of hang over the side and provide you with some edible greens. As for the ones in the shade, you might be able to get away with some of more hardier herbs as well. So something like rosemary that's going to do well in a in a hanging basket, but also have that hardiness to it. So maybe just look for things that are hardy, and maybe stick to something simple like herbs, just to kind of get you through the summer until you can do some fall planting. So with tomatoes, they can be a little tricky when it comes to their pollination. So tomatoes are essentially self-pollinating. So those flowers will pollinate themselves, but sometimes if they don't have access to an area where it might have some wind to kind of help them naturally self-pollinate, and they're not getting the additional help from other creatures like honeybees and butterflies and other flying creatures that typically help speed up the process of plants getting pollinated. If they don't have access to those creatures, and it could be giving them a reduced opportunity for pollination. So that might be one thing. They can handle the heat and the sun. So maybe move them somewhere where they can get a little bit more sun besides that evening sun that they're getting, or that sunset time. Move them somewhere they may get a little bit more exposure to the elements, and that might help them out. On top of that, you could maybe give them a little fertilizer boost. So find an organic fertilizer. You may be able to kind of give them a little bit of a boost to kind of help with that production of those tomatoes. As for what are good plants to use, as we've mentioned so far, you kind of have an assortment of some of your summer survival plants, I like to call them. So your perennial spinaches, any of the perennial spinaches will do well. If you do have space, you could do things like lemongrass and some other hardy herbs. Fruit trees work well as well as native plants for our area. And then if you are looking for anything vegetable-wise, you could try things like melons and also okra do well in the heat here. Yeah, so everything we've mentioned so far would be a great option for your summer planting. So just as a quick overview, perennial spinaches, okra, melons. You might be able to still get away with some tomatoes if you get them planted already large. Same thing with peppers. If you get them planted while they're big, you should be good to go. All these will do great in pots. So think about what you may be able to plant in those pots that will at least get you through the summer until you can get some of your more fall planting that you'll can have some of your more traditional plants. So stick with some of these that will do well in pots and survive the heat, as well as the lack of rain. Yes, so this is a great question, more on the culinary side. What I like to do as soon as I have some freshly cut herbs, or if I go to the farmer's market and get some herbs from the market, as soon as I get home, I typically get a nice mason jar, fill it with some fresh water, and you can pop those herbs straight in there and actually leave them out on the counter for up to a week or two, and they're going to do just fine without them even being in the refrigerator. If you would like to even further prolong their life, what you could do is get like just a regular plastic Ziploc baggie, rinse off your herbs, put them in the Ziploc baggie, seal them up, and kind of throw them in your vegetable crisper drawer, and they will typically live for a pretty long time in there, and they'll stay nice and crispy. So when you go back in there later on and open them up, they will be good to go. So there's two ways for keeping them fresh, fresh your herbs fresh. If you're looking for keeping them dry, one thing you could do is dehydrate them. If you don't have a dehydrator, what you could do is turn your oven on your lowest setting and just kind of pop them in there on a cookie sheet, and just keep a close eye on them because it will happen really fast. But let them dry out in the stove, take them out, and then you can kind of throw them in a brown bag or a Ziploc baggie and store them for quite a long time in your shelf. They'll make them shelf stable. And you can also wrap your herbs up in a paper towel and dampen them a little bit, stick it in your microwave for a minute or two, and they come out super crispy and dry, and then you can just store them as well, and they'll be shelf stable for quite a while. So try one of those two methods out, and it should get you going. Thanks, y'all, for tuning in for our first Ask Your Educator Q&A session. Stay tuned. We're going to have another opportunity coming up for y'all to ask more questions for our next Q&A session.